Christianity. As a Christian minister, King's main influence was Jesus Christ and the Christian Gospels, which he would almost always quote in his religious meetings, speeches at church, and in public discourses. King's faith was strongly based in Jesus' commandment of loving your neighbor as yourself, loving God above all, and loving your enemies, praying for them and blessing them. His nonviolent thought was also based in the injunction to turn the other cheek in the Sermon on the Mount, and Jesus' teaching of putting the sword back into its place, Matthew 26 verse 52. In his famous letter from Birmingham jail, King urged action consistent with what he describes as Jesus' extremist love, and also quoted numerous other Christian pacifist authors, which was very usual for him. In another sermon, he stated, "Before I was a civil rights leader, I was a preacher of the gospel. This was my first calling and it still remains my greatest commitment. Actually all that I do in civil rights I do because I consider it a part of my ministry. I have no other ambitions in life but to achieve excellence in the Christian ministry. I don't plan to run for any political office. I don't plan to do anything but remain a preacher. And what I'm doing in this struggle, along with many others, grows out of my feeling that the preacher must be concerned about the whole man." King's private writings show that he rejected biblical literalism. He described the Bible as mythological, doubted that Jesus was born of a virgin, suggested he may not have been bodily resurrected, and did not believe that the story of Jonah and the whale was true. The Measure of a Man. In 1959, King published a short book called The Measure of a Man, which contained his sermons What is Man, and The Dimensions of a Complete Life. The sermons argued for man's need for God's love and criticized the racial injustices of Western civilization. Nonviolence. Veteran African-American civil rights activist Bayard Rustin was King's first regular advisor on nonviolence. King was also advised by the white activists Harris Wofford and Glenn Smiley. Rustin and Smiley came from the Christian pacifist tradition, and Wofford and Rustin both studied Mahatma Gandhi's teachings. Rustin had applied nonviolence with the Journey of Reconciliation campaign in the 1940s, and Wofford had been promoting Gandhiism to Southern blacks since the early 1950s. King had initially known little about Gandhi and rarely used the term nonviolence during his early years of activism in the early 1950s. King initially believed in and practiced self-defense, even obtaining guns in his household as a means of defense against possible attackers. The pacifists guided King by showing him the alternative of nonviolent resistance, arguing that this would be a better means to accomplish his goals of civil rights than self-defense. King then vowed to no longer personally use arms. In the aftermath of the boycott, King wrote Stride Toward Freedom, which included the chapter Pilgrimage to Nonviolence. King outlined his understanding of nonviolence, which seeks to win an opponent to friendship, rather than to humiliate or defeat him. The chapter draws from an address by Wofford, with Rustin and Stanley Levison also providing guidance and ghostwriting. King was inspired by Gandhi and his success with nonviolent activism, and as a theology student, King described Gandhi as being one of the individuals who greatly reveal the working of the Spirit of God. King had for a long time wanted to take a trip to India. With assistance from Harris Wofford, the American Friends Service Committee, and other supporters, he was able to fund the journey in April 1959. The trip to India affected King, deepening his understanding of nonviolent resistance and his commitment to America's struggle for civil rights. In a radio address made during his final evening in India, King reflected, "Since being in India, I am more convinced than ever before that the method of nonviolent resistance is the most potent weapon available to oppressed people in their struggle for justice and human dignity." King's admiration of Gandhi's nonviolence did not diminish in later years. He went so far as to hold up his example when receiving the Nobel Peace Prize in 1964, hailing the successful precedent of using nonviolence in a magnificent way by Mohandas K. Gandhi to challenge the might of the British Empire. He struggled only with the weapons of truth, soul force, non-injury, and courage. Another influence for King's nonviolent method was Henry David Thoreau's essay on civil disobedience and its theme of refusing to cooperate with an evil system. He also was greatly influenced by the works of Protestant theologians Reinhold Niebuhr and Paul Tillich, and said that Walter Rauschenbusch's Christianity and the Social Crisis left an indelible imprint on his thinking by giving him a theological grounding for his social concerns. King was moved by Rauschenbusch's vision of Christians spreading social unrest in perpetual but friendly conflict with the state, simultaneously critiquing it and calling it to act as an instrument of justice. However, he was apparently unaware of the American tradition of Christian pacifism exemplified by Adin Ballou and William Lloyd Garrison. King frequently referred to Jesus' Sermon on the Mount as central for his work. King also sometimes used the concept of agape, brotherly Christian love. However, after 1960, he ceased employing it in his writings. Even after renouncing his personal use of guns, King had a complex relationship with the phenomenon of self-defense in the movement. He publicly discouraged it as a widespread practice, but acknowledged that it was sometimes necessary. Throughout his career, King was frequently protected by other civil rights activists who carried arms, such as Colonel Stone Johnson, Robert Hayling, and the Deacons for Defense and Justice. Criticism within the movement. King was criticized by other black leaders during the course of his participation in the civil rights movement. This included opposition by more militant thinkers such as Nation of Islam member Malcolm X. Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee founder Ella Baker regarded King as a charismatic media figure who lost touch with the grassroots of the movement as he became close to elite figures like Nelson Rockefeller. Stokely Carmichael, a protege of Baker's, became a black separatist and disagreed with King's plea for racial integration because he considered it an insult to a uniquely African American culture. He also took issue that King's nonviolence approach depended on appealing to America's conscience, feeling America had none to appeal to. Activism and involvement with Native Americans. King was an avid supporter of Native American rights. Native Americans were also active supporters of King's civil rights movement, which included the active participation of Native Americans. In fact, the Native American Rights Fund, NARF, was patterned after the NAACP's Legal Defense and Education Fund. The National Indian Youth Council, NIYC, was especially supportive in King's campaigns, especially the Poor People's Campaign in 1968. In King's book Why We Can't Wait, he writes, "Our nation was born in genocide when it embraced the doctrine that the original American, the Indian, was an inferior race. Even before there were large numbers of Negroes on our shores, the scar of racial hatred had already disfigured colonial society. From the 16th century forward, blood flowed in battles over racial supremacy. We are perhaps the only nation which tried as a matter of national policy to wipe out its indigenous population. Moreover, we elevated the tragic experience into a noble crusade. Indeed, even today we have not permitted ourselves to reject or to feel remorse for this shameful episode. Our literature, our films, our drama, our folklore all exalt it." King assisted Native American people in South Alabama in the late 1950s. At that time, the remaining Creek in Alabama were trying to completely desegregate schools in their area. The South had many racial problems. In this case, light-complexion Native children were allowed to ride school buses to previously all-white schools, while dark-skinned Native children from the same band were barred from riding the same buses. Tribal leaders, upon hearing of King's desegregation campaign in Birmingham, Alabama, contacted him for assistance. He promptly responded, and through his intervention, the problem was quickly resolved. In September 1959, King flew from Los Angeles, California, to Tucson, Arizona. After giving a speech at the University of Arizona on the ideals of using nonviolent methods in creating social change, He put into words his belief that one must not use force in this struggle but match the violence of his opponents with his suffering. King then went to Southside Presbyterian, a predominantly Native American church, and was fascinated by their photos. On the spur of the moment, King wanted to go to an Indian reservation to meet the people, so Casper Glenn took King to the Papago Indian Reservation. At the reservation, King met with all the tribal leaders, and others on the reservation then ate with them. King then visited another Presbyterian church near the reservation and preached there, attracting a Native American crowd. He later returned to Old Pueblo in March 1962, where he preached again to a Native American congregation, and then went on to give another speech at the University of Arizona. King would continue to attract the attention of Native Americans throughout the civil rights movement. During the 1963 March on Washington, there was a sizable Native American contingent, including many from South Dakota and many from the Navajo Nation. Native Americans were also active participants in the Poor People's Campaign in 1968. King was a major inspiration, along with the civil rights movement, of the Native American rights movement of the 1960s and many of its leaders. John Echo Hawk, a member of the Pawnee tribe who was the executive director and a founder of the Native American Rights Fund, stated, "Inspired by Dr. King, who was advancing the civil rights agenda of equality under the laws of this country, we thought that we could also use the laws to advance our Indianship, to live as tribes in our territories governed by our own laws under the principles of tribal sovereignty that had been with us ever since 1831. We believed that we could fight for a policy of self-determination that was consistent with U.S. law, and that we could govern our own affairs, define our own ways, and continue to survive in this society." Politics. As the leader of the SCLC, King maintained a policy of not publicly endorsing a U.S. political party or candidate. "I feel someone must remain in the position of non-alignment, so that he can look objectively at both parties and be the conscience of both, not the servant or master of either." In a 1958 interview, he expressed his view that neither party was perfect, saying, "I don't think the Republican Party is a party full of the Almighty God, nor is the Democratic Party. They both have weaknesses. And I'm not inextricably bound to either party." King did praise Democratic Senator Paul Douglas of Illinois as being the greatest of all senators because of his fierce advocacy for civil rights causes over the years. King critiqued both parties' performance on promoting racial equality. "Actually, the Negro has been betrayed by both the Republican and the Democratic Party. The Democrats have betrayed him by capitulating to the whims and caprices of the Southern Dixiecrats. The Republicans have betrayed him by capitulating to the blatant hypocrisy of reactionary right-wing Northern Republicans. And this coalition of Southern Dixiecrats and right-wing reactionary Northern Republicans defeats every bill and every move towards liberal legislation in the area of civil rights." Although King never publicly supported a political party or candidate for president, in a letter to a civil rights supporter in October 1956 he said that he had not decided whether he would vote for Democrat Adlai Stevenson II or Republican Dwight D. Eisenhower at the 1956 presidential election, but that, in the past, I always voted the Democratic ticket. In his autobiography, King says that in 1960 he privately voted for Democratic candidate John F. Kennedy. "I felt that Kennedy would make the best president. I never came out with an endorsement. My father did, but I never made one." King adds that he likely would have made an exception to his non-endorsement policy for a second Kennedy term, saying had President Kennedy lived, I would probably have endorsed him in 1964. In 1964, King urged his supporters and all people of goodwill to vote against Republican Senator Barry Goldwater for president, saying that his election would be a tragedy, and certainly suicidal almost, for the nation and the world. King supported the ideals of democratic socialism, although he was reluctant to speak directly of this support due to the anti-communist sentiment being projected throughout the United States at the time, and the association of socialism with communism. King believed that capitalism could not adequately provide the necessities of many American people, particularly the African American community. King expressed that the evils of capitalism are as real as the evils of militarism and evils of racism. King was critical of American culture, saying when machines and computers, profit motives and property rights are considered more important than people, the giant triplets of racism, materialism and militarism are incapable of being conquered, and that America must undergo a radical revolution of values. King considered that in America the problem is that we all too often have socialism for the rich and rugged free enterprise capitalism for the poor. In a 1952 letter to Coretta Scott, he said, "I imagine you already know that I am much more socialistic in my economic theory than capitalistic." In one speech, he stated that something is wrong with capitalism and said, there must be a better distribution of wealth, and maybe America must move toward a democratic socialism. King further said that capitalism has outlived its usefulness and failed to meet the needs of the masses. King had read Marx while at Morehouse, but while he rejected traditional capitalism, he rejected communism because of its materialistic interpretation of history that denied religion, its ethical relativism, and its political totalitarianism. Compensation. King stated that Black Americans, as well as other disadvantaged Americans, should be compensated for historical wrongs. In an interview conducted for Playboy in 1965, he said that granting Black Americans only equality could not realistically close the economic gap between them and whites. King said that he did not seek a full restitution of wages lost to slavery, which he believed impossible, but proposed a government compensatory program of $50 billion over 10 years to all disadvantaged groups. He posited that the money spent would be more than amply justified by the benefits that would accrue to the nation through a spectacular decline in school dropouts, family breakups, crime rates, illegitimacy, swollen relief rolls, rioting, and other social evils. He presented this idea as an application of the common law regarding settlement of unpaid labor, but clarified that he felt that the money should not be spent exclusively on blacks. He stated, "It should benefit the disadvantaged of all races." Television. Actress Nichelle Nichols planned to leave the science fiction television series Star Trek in 1967 after its first season, wanting to return to musical theater. She changed her mind after talking to King, who was a fan of the show. King explained that her character signified a future of greater racial harmony and cooperation. King told Nichols, "You are our image of where we're going, you're 300 years from now, and that means that's where we are and it takes place now. Keep doing what you're doing, you are our inspiration." As Nichols recounted, Star Trek was one of the only shows that King and his wife Coretta would allow their little children to watch. "And I thanked him and I told him I was leaving the show. All the smile came off his face. And he said, 'Don't you understand, for the first time we're seen as we should be seen. You don't have a black role. You have an equal role.'" For his part, the series creator, Gene Roddenberry, was deeply moved upon learning of King's support.